The fastest fighter of World War II lost not to Mustangs but to bureaucracy, fuel starvation, and command blunders. In the history of aviation, it's rare for an aircraft to leap so far ahead of its time as the Messerschmitt Me 262 did. It wasn't just a new airplane. It was a symbol of technological escape velocity, Germany's attempt to break out of the strategic cul-de-sac of World War II through scientific breakthrough. The world's first mass-produced jet fighter embodied the Luftwaffe's ambitions and illustrated how separating engineering genius from strategic common sense can lead to defeat, even with the weapon of the future in hand. Development of the Me 262 began back in 1938, when jet flight still bordered on science fiction. At first, the project moved sluggishly. A small group of engineers worked on it, while conventional piston-engine aircraft retained priority. The arrival of the Jumo 004 engine, temperamental as it was, made a decisive step possible. The first successful jet-powered flight took place in 1942, but nearly 2 more years passed before the aircraft saw real combat. There were many reasons, from technical issues with the turbines to political games inside the Reich. If you truly enjoy these stories, please like the video, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and please watch to the end. When the Me 262 finally entered the air war, it looked like a machine from another world. Its sharp wings and underslung engine nacelles impressed even battle-hardened Allied pilots. But the main thing was the performance. The Me 262 reached speeds up to 870 kilometers per hour, about 150 to 200 kilometers per hour faster than the best Allied fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the Hawker Tempest. It could leave combat at will, shrugging off pursuit. Its armament, 430mm Mk108 cannon, turned it into a flying guillotine. A couple of short bursts could tear a bomber to pieces. Some variants added R4M rocket rails, essentially a salvo system for ripping apart dense B-17 formations. Even a single hit to the fuselage or wing could turn a heavy, flying fortress into a fireball. The Allies quickly realized they were facing a serious threat. Early reports from pilots who survived Me 262 attacks sounded like tall tales. "It shot past me like a bullet. I didn't even have time to turn my head." Classic dogfights, maneuvering duels, extended tussles, lost their meaning in a world where one side had a speed advantage of dozens of percent. Allied pilots began to panic. Aircraft they'd considered the pinnacle of engineering suddenly felt obsolete. The first combat sorties by Me 262s came in the summer of 1944. One of the most memorable episodes involved KG-J-54 attacking bomber streams over Germany. The result was staggering. The Americans lost several flying fortresses before they could even react. The effect was amplified by the words of German aces like Adolf Galland, who called the Me 262 the most formidable weapon ever to take to the air. On paper, and in isolated episodes, the Me 262 showed astonishing effectiveness. In a single sortie, an experienced pilot could shoot down 2 or 3 aircraft and escape unscathed. The plane was stable at high speeds, provided an excellent gun platform, and radically disrupted the rhythm of the air war. The Allies hurried to adapt tactics. Fighter patrols over airfields, ambushes during takeoff and landing, strikes on factories. Even the appearance of Britain's Gloucester Meteor didn't change the overall picture. It was slower and used primarily against German V-1 flying bombs. Thus, the Me 262 became more than just a combat aircraft. It was a ghost of future war peering into 1944. In theory, it could have shifted the balance of power in the sky. In theory, it could have disrupted the bombing of the Ruhr, Berlin, and other centers. In theory, it could have become the Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon Hitler dreamed of. But theory crashes against practice, and the Me 262, genius though it was, became a prisoner of the circumstances of its birth. Resource constraints, political ambitions, and strategic disorganization. Its moment in the spotlight was too brief, but bright enough to remain in the memory of military historians as a symbol of a technological victory that slipped away. Speed was the Me 262's calling card, and its trap. It rose into the sky like a herald of a new era, almost a head above piston fighters in the literal sense. In level flight, the Schwalbe could leave the Mustang, Spitfire, Tempest, and Thunderbolt behind as easily as a jet airliner leaves an old prop-driven DC-3. The Me 262 pilot chose the moment to enter combat, and the moment to exit it. That changed the very logic of air combat. For the first time, a machine could ignore the classic turn-fight mindset. No fight to the last turn. Only an approach, a strike, and disappearance. Speed plus firepower seemed like a formula guaranteed to deliver air superiority. A short burst from four 30mm Mk-108 cannons turned an American bomber into a flying torch. Those lucky enough to survive described a Me 262 attack like a collision with disaster. A sudden rush, a flash, and the skin of the aircraft already flying off in shreds. Meanwhile, the jet fighter itself was almost invulnerable. Bomber turrets couldn't traverse in time, and escort pilots often didn't even notice the attacker before it had already vanished over the horizon. But everything that creates an advantage can also become a weakness. Start with the main point. The Mk-108s had a low muzzle velocity, which worsened accuracy at high closing speeds, and the Me 262 was very, very fast. Closing on a target at nearly 900 kilometers per hour, the pilot had literally fractions of a second to aim and fire. If you missed, there would be no second try. It was especially hard to fight maneuvering fighters rather than bulky bombers. A moment's hesitation, and you were no longer in position to attack. In some cases, pilots even bled off speed before the run-in, which made them vulnerable and negated the technological edge. The next Achilles heel was maneuverability. The Me 262 was poor in turns. Not catastrophically poor, but enough to avoid a dogfight. The Mustang, Tempest, and Spitfire all had tighter turning circles, better low-speed handling, and more responsive engines. The Me 262, by contrast, was heavy, inert, and suffered from sluggish throttle response. At low altitude against an experienced opponent, these shortcomings could be fatal. Luftwaffe pilots knew. Enter a turning fight and you're playing by someone else's rules. So the core tactic was a high-speed, high-altitude attack. Boom and zoom. Takeoff and landing were particularly dramatic problems. The Jumo 004 jet engines had extremely poor throttle response. They spooled up slowly, reacted badly to throttle changes, and a sharp push could simply flame them out. That meant the Me 262 was vulnerable in the critical phases of flight, during the takeoff roll and during deceleration. It was easy to catch it off guard on the runway, especially given that its takeoff run was longer than a piston aircraft's. Allied pilots figured this out quickly and began to loiter near known airfields, literally hunting the jets during takeoff and landing. Shooting down a Me 262 in open-air combat was almost impossible. On the ground or on final approach, it was entirely feasible. Here we get to the key point. The Allies adapted. At first, they were shocked. Then shock gave way to analysis. Briefings were rewritten, tactics adjusted, units retrained in new methods. Escort fighters covering the bombers began patrolling at higher altitudes to gain an advantage for a potential top-down attack on the Me 262. Airfield coverage became a priority. The Allies flooded the sky with Mustangs, creating a kind of aerial blockade over Luftwaffe bases. They also developed specific maneuvers to spoil Me 262 attacks on bomber streams. Weaving patterns, tighter formations, and converging fire from multiple turrets. All of this reduced the odds of a successful strike. Some B-17s even received additional sights and compensators for engaging very fast targets. The very geometry of the combat boxes was revised to maximize overlapping fields of fire. All this made even the Me 262 vulnerable, especially in the hands of an inexperienced pilot. Against this backdrop, the Me 262's main weakness emerged: its dependence on context. It was magnificent in theory and in trials. It could deal real damage when used correctly, but real war rarely offers ideal conditions. Little fuel, poor visibility, an unexpected breakdown, a delayed shipment of parts, an airfield under attack, a poorly trained pilot. Any of these could turn a technological masterpiece into a fragile target. The Allies, meanwhile, had thousands of stable, proven aircraft, solid logistics, and masses of pilots. The Me 262 could be faster, but it could not be everywhere. There weren't enough of them. They broke. They were bent to missions they weren't designed for. Here lies the paradox. Total speed bred total vulnerability. The Me 262 became a victim of its own conceptual purity. It couldn't do slow. It couldn't do mass. It couldn't do things the old way. And while on some days it could perform miracles, even in the enemy's eyes, by war's end it was clear. The jet-age knight had lost to the infantry crowd. Speed doesn't save you from reality if you can't adapt. The irony is that the Allies, with their slow Mustangs and Pipers, proved far more tactically flexible than the champions of the weapon of the future. If the Me-262 could have changed the course of the air war, it could have done so only under one condition: with time, fuel, experienced pilots, and rational leadership. The last, it seems, the Third Reich never had. The story of the Me-262 is not merely about a technical marvel. It's about how political interference, internal power struggles, and strategic short-sightedness erased a potential that any aircraft designer would have envied. It's naive to think the Me-262's fate was decided only in the skies. It was decided in offices, beneath ceilings heavy with ambition, delusion, and a superstitious faith in miracle weapons. The most infamous and nearly textbook episode was Hitler's decision to turn the Me-262 from a fighter into a bomber. This wasn't a myth or exaggeration. It was a documented act of interference. In 1943, after learning of the jet's capabilities, the Führer became obsessed with using it as a fast strike aircraft capable of attacking ground targets ahead of the expected Allied invasion. In Hitler's eyes, remember, he was a World War I frontline soldier but no expert on modern aviation. Such a weapon looked ideal. A plane too fast for flak or fighters, dropping bombs and vanishing unharmed. The problem was that the Me-262's design had never been meant for bombing. To adapt it, engineers had to redesign the fuselage, install bomb racks in sights, recalculate the center of gravity, and rework the aerodynamics. That took months. During that time, the jet wasn't entering service in its intended role. As an interceptor, the one mission where it could have made a real difference. The irony was that Hitler never outright banned its fighter use. He merely insisted that the bomber variant had priority. But in Nazi Germany, a Führer's priority wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, and ignoring it was suicidal. Designers, pilots, and even senior Luftwaffe officers tried to argue. General and ace Adolf Galland openly called the decision a disaster. But confronting Hitler in 1943, after repeated defeats, was becoming deadly. Some officers, including Erhard Milch, tried to balance the situation by creating parallel programs that kept fighter deployment moving. But this only deepened the confusion. Instead of a unified program for introducing the new jet fighter, Germany now had several competing ones, each starving for resources, manpower, and time. To the chaos was added chronic incompetence within the Luftwaffe bureaucracy. After the suicide of aviation inspector Ernst Udet in 1941, the command structure disintegrated. Hermann Göring, nominal head of the Air Force, had by then become more politician than strategist, consumed by intrigue, self-preservation, and the hunt for scapegoats rather than reforming his service. Subordinates were afraid to report bad news. Distorted information flowed upward, and decisions came down detached from reality. Hitler was told, for instance, that the Me-262 was already ready as a bomber, a lie on which he based entire strategic plans divorced from fact. The delay in deploying the Me-262 proved fatal. For nearly 18 months after its first successful flight, the jet still hadn't entered operational units. The delay stemmed not only from technical difficulties, but also from a complete lack of political will at every level. German factories, ordered to build bomber variants, produced machines unsuited to the actual air war. When full Me-262 fighter squadrons finally began forming in late 1944, it was too late. The Allies owned the skies, critical infrastructure lay in ruins, and there was neither fuel nor trained pilots even to maintain the front. Production itself collapsed during the war's final months. Germany could no longer supply the heat-resistant alloys needed for jet engines. The Jumo 004 turbines had a miserable lifespan, 10 to 25 hours, before failing. Building a single Me-262 required dozens of subcontractors, and bombing had shattered that logistical web. Factories were in ruins, transport lines severed, workers drafted or dead. Some assembly shops were moved underground, but that solved only camouflage, not efficiency. Many aircraft sat idle without engines, ammunition, or key parts. Of more than 1,400 Me-262s built, fewer than a third ever saw combat. A further drag came from the industrial skeptics who simply didn't believe in the Me-262's future. Several aviation firms bet instead on safer, more profitable piston projects like the BF-109 and FW-190. Designer Willy Messerschmitt himself at first gave the jet only minimal attention, preferring to keep production lines running on proven models. Only after the Me-262's public demonstration and military approval did priorities shift. But even then, the jet remained something of a partisan project, pushed forward through layers of bureaucratic inertia. All these failures exposed a fundamental flaw in the Nazi war machine: its inability to manage complexity rationally. The closer Germany moved toward defeat, the more decisions were made in panic, out of fear, driven by ideology instead of analysis. The Me-262 became a hostage to a system where the talent of engineers and the bravery of pilots couldn't outweigh the blindness of leadership. In this sense, the aircraft's true enemy wasn't the Mustang. It was the dictator's narcissism and the paralysis of his command structure. Technology can change the course of war only when guided by those who understand it. In the case of the Me-262, that understanding never came. In war, victory depends not only on technology, but on the ability to deploy it in time, in sufficient numbers, and with enough people who know how to use it. The Me-262 was an undeniable technological breakthrough, but at the implementation stage, its fate became captive to blunt arithmetic. Not enough aircraft, not enough fuel, not enough people. Even if the jet fighter could have turned the air war, and in the right context its capabilities were indeed impressive, it was produced too little too late. And when it finally appeared in the sky, it had neither a solid support system nor enough capable hands to fly it effectively. The manpower problem was decisive. At the height of its power in 1940-1941, the Luftwaffe fielded hundreds of experienced pilots, veterans of the Spanish Civil War and the campaigns in Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. By 1944, very few of them remained. Most had been killed in combat with Allied and Soviet air forces. Others were wounded, medically grounded, or moved into staff roles. Training new pilots required time, fuel, and resources, things Germany had less and less of. Unlike familiar piston aircraft, the Me-262 demanded a completely different level of training. It was faster, more inertial, and more difficult to handle, especially on takeoff and landing. The Jumo 004 engines did not forgive mistakes. A sharp throttle change could cause a flameout. They overheated and delivered unstable thrust at different settings. A pilot accustomed to the BF-109 or FW-190 had to retrain not just for a new type, but for a new philosophy of flight. Traditional skills weren't useless on the Me-262, but they weren't enough. In reality, jet training was catastrophically simplified. Young flyers, sometimes with only 20 to 30 flight hours, were moved onto combat machines after minimal instruction. Very few two-seat trainer versions, the Me-262B, were produced. As a result, most pilots learned by trial and error, often while on operational alert. Errors, inevitably, followed. Aircraft were lost due to improper takeoff or landing procedures, engine overstress, or a simple failure to grasp the peculiarities of jet flight. Many Me-262s were lost without firing a single shot. Even talented, reasonably experienced pilots couldn't fully realize the aircraft's potential because the necessary infrastructure was missing. Airfields suitable for jet operations were few, and under constant Allied reconnaissance and attack. The long runways the Me-262 required made it vulnerable. Damage to any section could put the strip out of action. Fuel supply also faltered. The Jumo 004 demanded a specific kerosene blend, and by 1944-1945, Germany's oil supply and refining were already in jeopardy. After the Allies captured Romanian oil fields and wrecked synthetic fuel plants, the Luftwaffe was on starvation rations. In some cases, even if an aircraft was ready to fly, it wasn't allocated fuel. The available stock went to Berlin's defense, to ace squadrons, or to other priority units. Beyond fuel, spare parts were in acute short supply. Like any complex machine, the Me-262 required regular maintenance. Engines needed replacement or major overhauls every 20 to 25 flight hours. But there were no spare turbines. Production lines were erratic and frequently bombed. Ground crews working on jets often had only crash courses, or were retrained from piston aircraft. There was no large-scale logistics system or centralized repair network for the Me-262. only scattered efforts to patch what existed. Countless aircraft sat idle for weeks waiting for the smallest part. A fuel nozzle, a stabilizer, even simple skin panels. Jet units became less combat formations than collections of museum pieces, unable to change the situation. The morale impact was equally destructive. Pilots who received the newest aircraft explored the Schwalbe's capabilities with excitement and unease, but quickly realized they were isolated. Lack of coordination with other units, inadequate support, airfield bombings, and fuel shortages bred a sense of helplessness. Even aces like Galland or Nowotny wrote in their memoirs that they felt more like participants in a doomed experiment than fighters for victory. For most pilots, a combat sortie ended not with an enemy downed, but with an accident, a breakdown, or a forced landing. In the end, the Me-262 became a prisoner of its own runways. Understanding its vulnerability, the Allies began hunting the jets not in the air, but on the ground. They developed specific airfield ambush tactics. Allied fighters patrolled near known Me-262 bases and attacked at the moments of greatest vulnerability, during the takeoff roll or on approach. A jet engine needed time to spool up to full thrust. A piston-engined Mustang could make several attacks in that window. Caught on the runway, the Me-262 became an oversized target. Dozens of machines were destroyed this way, without a single aerial duel. These constant attacks led to attempts to protect airfields with flak, camouflage, and dummy runways. There were even projects to launch the Me-262 with catapults, rocket assist, or sled undercarriages. But all of that smacked of desperation, not systemic solution. By 1945, it was clear that jet sorties were becoming rarer and rarer. And even when they did fly, the effect was episodic. Strikes on bomber formations were painful, but not massed. Allied losses rose slowly. Luftwaffe resources evaporated quickly. Thus, even with a technology capable of reshaping the war, Germany was unable to use it. The Me-262 could not compensate for logistical failure, fuel scarcity, and a training crisis. It was an island of the future in an ocean of collapse. And, as history often shows, technological superiority is powerless against systemic breakdown. In the end, the jet fighter remained more a symbol of an unrealized victory than a practical weapon. A machine that might have changed everything became just another casualty of a start that came far too late. In the history of war, there are always technologies that appeared in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Me-262, the pinnacle of Nazi Germany's aviation engineering, became exactly such a machine. Ahead of its time, yet trapped in a reality unprepared for it. As often happens with weapons on the edge of eras, it became a symbol not of victory, but of a chance lost. And the main question historians and engineers still ask sounds deceptively simple. What would have happened if the Me-262 had appeared earlier, in sufficient numbers, with proper support and leadership? Let's play out an alternate scenario. Imagine Germany beginning full-scale production of the Me-262 as early as 1943. Imagine that designers received true priority, not just on paper, but in practice. That Hitler had not meddled with his bomber obsession. That the jet fighter entered service as intended. A high-speed interceptor built to tear through the Allied bomber armada. In such conditions, things could have unfolded differently. In 1943 to 1944, when the Luftwaffe still hadn't been swept from the skies, a mass appearance of Me-262s could have dealt a significant blow to U.S. daylight raids and Britain's night bombings. Its firepower and speed would have made it the perfect bomber killer. Even with only 300 to 400 combat-ready aircraft, Germany might have disrupted a series of massive strikes against industrial and transport hubs. And if those operations had been backed by solid tactics and fuel supplies, the Allies might have been forced to rethink their entire air offensive. It's possible that the Normandy invasion itself would have been delayed. Without air supremacy, the landing would have been suicide. The Allies might have been forced back to night raids and the use of fast, light aircraft like the Mosquito, instead of heavy B-17s and Lancasters. Such a scenario could have given Germany a few months, perhaps half a year, of breathing room. Enough time to strengthen Western defenses, slow the Soviet advance in the East, and bring other experimental designs into service, such as the He-162 fighter or Arado AR-234 jet bomber. But all those what-ifs break against two unyielding facts: numbers and logistics. Even under perfect conditions, The Me-262 could not have overturned the basic imbalance in resources. By 1944, the industrial potential of the United States and the British Empire dwarfed that of Germany. The Allies were producing thousands of aircraft each month, training pilots worldwide, and maintaining an unshakable supply chain of fuel and spare parts. The loss of dozens or even hundreds of bombers in flight wouldn't have derailed the campaign. The Allies could replace them almost instantly and continue their offensive. This was well understood in both the Pentagon and the British Air Ministry. Early reports on the Me-262 provoked respect and unease, but not panic. The plane was recognized as a threat, but one that could be contained. Commanders analyzed its weaknesses. Long takeoff runs, poor protection during landing, unreliable engines, a shortage of trained pilots. Adaptive counter-strategies followed. Airfield patrols, concentrated defensive fire from formations, adjusted altitude tactics. Britain's Gloucester Meteor wasn't sent to hunt Me-262s. It was deemed too risky, but Allied planners were confident their massive air power could absorb the blow. Still, even limited Me-262 operations left an impression. Pilots admitted they had never faced an opponent so literally untouchable. Soviet flyers on the Eastern Front recalled rare encounters with Me-262s, as if facing a flying shadow. American aces shot down by jets acknowledged their superiority in speed and striking power, but those were exceptions. Most Me-262s never fought. They sat on airfields, waiting for parts, fuel, or orders. And when they did take off, they were often destroyed before reaching their targets. Ultimately, the Me-262 fell victim to systemic failure, not technical miscalculation. It worked. It killed. It terrified. But it could not win. History is full of weapons too new for the old systems that wielded them. Their arrival doesn't guarantee victory. In fact, it often exposes the weaknesses that were once hidden. The Me-262 proved that even air superiority cannot compensate for lost years, a shattered economy, and leadership lost in illusion. Ironically, it was the Allies who recognized the Me-262's true value after the war. The U.S. and Britain dismantled captured jets piece by piece, studying every bolt and idea. The technology born in wartime Germany became the foundation for a new generation of aircraft. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, and the jet age that defined the Cold War. In that sense, the Me-262 did win, just in another war, in the laboratories and hangars of the future. The story of the Me-262 is not just a tragedy of a missed opportunity, but a lesson. It shows that even the finest machines can lose if they lack a system to sustain them. Without logistics, manpower, fuel, leadership, and strategic vision, no plane flies, not even the fastest one. Victory is not about speed, it's about preparation, resources, and timing. In 1945, the Me-262 was simply too fast for the era it was born into, and too alone in a sky where the outcome had already been decided.